Hey guys, settle in. Maybe dim the lights. Make sure your tea's within arm's reach. Because tonight, we're gliding back a few hundred years. And we're spending some quiet time with the most socially awkward families in medieval Europe. The children of executioners. Yeah, the people whose parents literally killed for a living. And somehow they still had to show up to school like everything was normal. The unwanted profession. So, in the cozy tapestry of medieval society, where everyone had a job, a god, and probably a goat, executioners were the necessary evil no one wanted to acknowledge. They were like the medieval version of that one cousin who does something weird with computers. You knew you needed them, but you definitely didn't want to sit next to them at dinner. Executioners were the ones swinging the sword, chopping off heads, breaking bones, or, if it was a slow week, branding thieves in the town square. Someone had to do it. But the church didn't love them. The nobles didn't invite them over. And the common folk avoided their houses like they were radioactive. And that's where the children come in. Because, well, executioners had families too. They had wives. They had kids. They had mortgages. Or whatever the medieval version of a mortgage was. Maybe 3 goats and half a cabbage field. And for those kids, life was complicated. Born into stigma. Let's imagine this. It's 16th century Germany. You're the son of the local executioner. You've just woken up in your small wooden house. The air smells faintly of iron. And something you don't want to identify. You step outside, and everyone in town immediately crosses the street. Welcome to your childhood. Executioners' families lived under a kind of social quarantine. They weren't technically criminals, but they might as well have been. People believed their very touch could bring bad luck, or even spiritual pollution. Because when your dad's job involves chopping heads off in the name of justice, apparently the moral grime rubs off on you. Kids of executioners couldn't go to normal schools. Many towns banned them entirely from classrooms, guilds, or churches. So, they grew up in these little family bubbles. Small, isolated, generationally doomed bubbles. And the funny part, you couldn't even really quit. If your dad was an executioner, chances were you'd become one too. Not because you wanted to, but because no one else would hire you. It was a closed loop of blood and bureaucracy. The accidental dynasties. By the 1500s, executioner families had turned into dynasties, generations of them, all passing down the same tools, the same techniques, and the same miserable social status. It was almost like royalty, but the opposite. Royal families married within the same few houses to keep their blood pure. Executioner families married within their own tiny circle, because nobody else would come near them. In fact, some of these families developed a strange sort of pride about it. They became good at what they did, skilled, efficient, and, most importantly, discreet. A clean execution could save a condemned man from extra pain. And in a weird twist of fate, that was seen as an act of mercy. So the children learned, from an early age, how to sharpen blades, how to measure the drop of a hanging rope, how to prepare a body for burial after the show was over. Their bedtime stories were less about fairy godmothers and more about correct sword angles. The lone wolf kids. Of course. Growing up socially radioactive did things to a kid's psyche. There are records of executioners' children being bullied, beaten, or simply ostracized. Even adults avoided them. Bakers wouldn't sell them bread. Barbers refused them service. And because the church saw executioners as morally tainted, many priests refused to baptize or marry their kids. So yeah, a bit of a lonely childhood. But not everyone accepted that fate quietly. Some kids rebelled. There are stories, especially from France and Switzerland, of executioners, sons trying to run away and start fresh. They'd change their names, move to another city, pretend they were blacksmiths or butchers, and sometimes it worked. Until someone recognized their last name. Names like Sanson, Franz Schmidt, Desplanches. Once people heard those, doors closed fast. You could reinvent yourself all you wanted, but your bloodline was your resume. Franz Schmidt, the gentleman of death. Speaking of bloodlines, let's pause on one of the most famous executioner families in history, the Schmidts of Nuremberg. Franz Schmidt, born in 1555, was one of those reluctant heirs to the family business. His father had been forced into execution work by a prince, basically on a whim. Imagine your boss saying, "Congrats. You're now in charge of all public beheadings." And you just can't say no. So Franz was born into it. And while most people would have grown bitter or unhinged, he somehow turned it into a career of dignity. He kept meticulous records of his executions. Over 45 years, he carried out 394 of them and documented everyone. Names, crimes, methods, all written in this precise, almost detached handwriting. And weirdly enough, people later praised him for being humane, because he made it quick, clean, professional. A man who killed nearly 400 people, admired for his work ethic. But beneath that calm professionalism was a lifelong sadness. Schmidt wanted his children to escape the family curse, and thanks to his reputation and a little royal favor, they did. His son became a doctor, a literal healer, born from a line of executioners. Talk about poetic irony. Executioner towns, the other side of the fence. Now, not all executioners were stuck in misery. In some parts of Europe, their families found loopholes. They became specialists, offering medical services, animal slaughter, and wound care. Basically, all the jobs that involved touching blood when no one else wanted to. Executioners were sometimes called masters of life and death, because when they weren't chopping heads, they were patching people up. They set broken bones. They drained infections. They even delivered babies. And that's where their kids learned another set of skills. Medicine, herbal remedies, surgery. You'd think that might make them more popular. Spoiler, it didn't. People still wanted their healing. They just didn't want to talk to them afterward. It's a bit like ordering food from someone you secretly despise. You'll take the meal, but you're definitely not leaving a tip. Family business. Unwanted legacy. The job stayed in families for generations. In some cities, the position was hereditary by law, a kind of grim monarchy. When the father died or retired, the oldest son took over. No debate, no choice. Imagine being 16 and realizing your entire future is already written in someone else's blood. And so these kids grew up in a strange duality, feared by everyone, yet needed by everyone. They were both invisible and unavoidable. A few lucky ones escaped by joining the army. Soldiers didn't care about your family history, as long as you could fight. Others joined traveling fairs or became butchers. It's a thin line between chopping animals and, other things. But most, they stayed, they learned, and they swung the sword when their time came. The weird social loophole. Marriage. Now, let's talk about romance. Because yes, even executioners' kids fell in love, just not with normal people. They usually married within their own group. Other executioner families, tanners, knackers, people who disposed of animal carcasses, or gravediggers. Basically, anyone equally shunned by society. It was a small dating pool, and it led to what historians politely call tight family networks. You and I would probably call it inbreeding adjacent. There's a story from 17th century Bavaria about a young woman, daughter of an executioner, who fell in love with a blacksmith. He wanted to marry her, until his neighbors found out. They warned him that marrying into an executioner family would curse his forge, so he backed out. And she ended up marrying another executioner's son, 2 towns over. The cycle continued. Children of the axe, children of silence. What's haunting about these kids isn't just the stigma. It's the silence. We don't have many letters or diaries from them. Most couldn't read or write. Their stories survive only through court records, guild complaints, and church bans. It's like they were erased from public memory before they even had a chance to exist. But every now and then, one peeks through the cracks, like Maria Schmidt, Franz's daughter, who tried to open a small apothecary in Nuremberg. People protested. They said her tainted hands shouldn't mix medicines. She appealed to the city council, and, shockingly, she won. The same town that once banned her family finally let her open shop. A quiet victory after centuries of isolation. The psychological toll. So, how did this generational ostracism shape them? Hard to say, but modern psychologists have a field day with it. Imagine growing up watching your parent execute people publicly, and then eating dinner with them like it's just another Tuesday. Many records mention the children being serious, obedient, and silent. Traits you'd expect from kids who grew up surrounded by death, ritual, and stigma. But there's also evidence that some were remarkably gentle. They developed empathy through exposure. Seeing human suffering so often made them oddly compassionate. A few even became healers, priests, or teachers when allowed. They understood mortality better than anyone, and maybe that gave them a strange kind of peace. Floating forward. So, as we drift further into the night, let's keep that image in mind. A child sitting outside the town walls, sharpening a blade he never wanted to touch. The villagers whispering behind his back, and him just quietly existing in the space between necessity and rejection. Because that was the reality. For hundreds of families across Europe, people who kept the law's machinery running, but were never invited to share its rewards. In the next part, we'll keep tracing their lives, how these families evolved into semi-respected professions, how some turned their bloody skills into science, and how a few tried to marry their way out of disgrace. So go ahead, take a breath, maybe sip that tea again. And when you're ready, we'll wander back into the strange twilight world of Europe's forgotten executioner. Families, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived almost 30 minutes of medieval social misery, and we're just getting comfortable. So, let's float deeper into this world where executioners, children grew up not only handling death, but also quietly learning how to save lives. Because, ironically, the people most associated with killing were sometimes the best healers in town. Yeah, welcome to medieval Europe, where logic took a long lunch break. The blood and the blade. We left off with the Schmidt family, that oddly dignified dynasty of executioners. Now, it's important to understand that in the Middle Ages, the line between doctor and butcher was thinner than a cathedral wafer. Surgeons weren't the glamorous white-coated professionals we imagine today. They were craftsmen, tradesmen, and many of them learned their trade through, well, practice. Lots of practice. Who had more experience with human anatomy than the people literally chopping it open on a regular basis? Exactly. So over time, executioners started using that experience. They learned which cuts bled out fastest, which wounds could heal, which couldn't. They handled corpses daily, studying muscle, bone, and sinew, often out of morbid curiosity, sometimes out of genuine fascination. Their children saw this too. They watched their parents offer prayers before a beheading, comfort the doomed, even whisper small blessings. And it changed them. It gave them this paradoxical empathy and so awareness that life and death were two sides of the same coin, constantly flipping in the wind. So when those kids became healers, they carried that same energy. Quiet, compassionate, detached, but deeply human. Nitsi Sasha Trainon, the medical legacy. By the 17th and 18th centuries, some of these families were producing actual doctors, legally recognized, university-trained physicians, though usually after generations of fighting stigma. Remember Franz Schmidt's son who became a doctor? He wasn't alone. The same pattern appeared in France, Austria, even Poland. It's almost poetic. Generations swinging the sword, and then one day, someone picks up a scalpel instead. There's something profoundly medieval about that. Redemption not through religion, but through sheer stubborn professionalism. Nitsi Sasha Trainon, the line between respect and rejection. Of course, respect came slowly. You could save half the village from plague, And people would still whisper, "Yeah, but isn't his father the hangman?" Even when executioners' kids earned degrees, they were often denied guild membership or civic rights. Their licenses were stamped, but their reputations weren't clean. There's a 1730 record from Bavaria of a man named Johann Riechel, Itiri, son of an executioner, who passed his surgeon's exam with distinction. But when he tried to open a practice, the local council banned him, saying his ancestry was unfit for honorable professions. So he treated patients in secret, in barns, alleys, back rooms, and he never stopped. Because apparently, spite is a great motivator for compassion. Nitsi Sasha Trainon, a family business in transition. As Europe modernized, the old order of public executions began to crumble. By the 18th century, fewer people were being tortured for entertainment, at least officially. That meant fewer jobs for executioners. Some families pivoted into medicine entirely. Others opened barber shops, bone-setting clinics, or even veterinary practices. A few simply faded into anonymity. The children changing their names, moving to cities, marrying normal people, and slowly the line dissolved. By the 19th century, most Europeans no longer knew which families had once been hangmen. The stigma washed away with time, as all stigmas eventually do. Nitsi Sasha Trainon, the human touch. Let's float down for a moment and think about what it meant, emotionally, to live like that. Imagine growing up with everyone avoiding you. But when they were dying, they called for you. They didn't want to touch you until they needed your hands. That kind of duality shapes a person. Many executioners' descendants carried a deep, quiet melancholy. It shows up in their wills, their petitions, their letters, an almost obsessive desire to be useful, accepted, good. There's one record of an executioner's daughter in Vienna who spent her entire inheritance building a small hospice for the poor. When asked why, she said, "My family took life for the law. I will give life for mercy." Not exactly the happy-go-lucky bedtime story you'd tell a child, but it's hauntingly human. Tools of the trade, of course. The tools stuck around long after the families faded. Many executioners' swords and axes ended up in museums, engraved with initials, dates, sometimes short prayers. One famous blade, belonging to Meister Franz Schmidt himself, still sits in Nuremberg. Its edge is polished, the handle worn smooth by generations of hands. It's both a weapon and a relic of craftsmanship. And sometimes people forget. Those same hands that held the sword might have also set a broken arm, or delivered a child, or stitched a wound. The boundary between death and healing was just porous, very porous. A glimpse into the homes. If you walked into an executioner's house, which, by the way, most people absolutely refused to do, you'd find something surprisingly normal. A tidy living room, herbs drying from the rafters, a few anatomy drawings, if the family could read, children playing quietly in the yard, probably watched from a distance by suspicious neighbors. The smell, though, was different. A mix of iron, leather, and herbs. The scent of work, of constant cleaning. of trying to make death smell a little less like death. Their homes were usually built just outside the city walls, far enough to keep the respectable folks comfortable, close enough to be summoned when needed. A kind of permanent halfway house between life and the gallows. And for the children, that was their world, neither fully in nor fully out. Half citizen, half ghost, quiet rebellion. By the Enlightenment era, some descendants of executioners started writing memoirs, treatises, little essays about morality. A few even became philosophers, arguing that crime and punishment should focus on reform, not revenge, which, coming from them, was, well, insightful. After all, who better to understand the futility of cruelty than the people forced to administer it? Their quiet rebellion wasn't in the streets. It was in letters, in ideas, in the decision to raise children who healed instead of harmed. Every generation softened a little more, until one day they just blended in. No one whispered anymore. The name on the door was just another family. Respectable, forgettable, free. And yet, even now, centuries later, some surnames still carry echoes. Museums still display executioners' coats embroidered with family crests. Yes, they had those, and medical colleges still preserve surgical tools that trace back to unofficial healers. In a strange way, they're the ancestors of both doctors and undertakers. The guardians of beginnings and endings, people who learned over generations. That dignity isn't about what society calls you. It's about how steady your hands are when it matters. Floating forward again. So, as we drift toward the next stretch of this story, picture one of those executioner children all grown up. He's in his small stone house, candle flickering on the table. Someone's knocked on the door. A neighbor's wife is in labor. They wouldn't normally ask him, but it's midnight and the midwife's far away. He walks quietly through the snow, a bundle of cloth under one arm. He delivers the baby, ties the cord, washes his hands, and slips back into the night. No one thanks him. No one mentions it in church. But the next morning, another life continues. Quietly. Because of him. That's the strange, peaceful rhythm these families lived in. Half exile, half salvation. And in the next part, we'll wander into the social experiments that tried to rehabilitate executioners, children, the weird charity schools, the marriage bans, and the few strange cases where nobles tried to adopt them as moral trophies. So, take another slow breath, maybe stretch a little, and when you're ready, we'll keep drifting through this gentle purgatory of medieval outcasts. Hey again, if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. Most people would have drifted off somewhere between tainted ancestry and herbal ointments. But not you. You're still here. So let's keep floating through this dimly lit corner of history. The one full of unwanted families trying, somehow, to be normal. Tonight, we're following what happened when society decided it might, possibly, sort of maybe feel bad for the children of executioners. Spoiler, it went exactly as awkwardly as you'd expect. With Musendao, the late medieval pity project. By the 17th century, Europe had started to grow a conscience, or at least a bureaucratic version of one. People began realizing that being born to an executioner wasn't exactly a moral failing, and yet no one really wanted to sit next to them at dinner either. So governments and churches did what governments and churches do best. They created committees. These committees met to discuss what should be done with the offspring of dishonorable men, which sounds noble, until you realize "done with" was the key phrase. The options usually included things like forcing the kids into monasteries, apprenticing them to the army, or shipping them off to remote farms. You know, all the loving gestures of a society deeply uncomfortable with compassion. With Musengao, the charity school experiment. Let's take one example. In 18th century Würzburg, a small German city, famous for wine and mild existential dread, the local bishop decided to rehabilitate the children of executioners. He built a charity school just for them. The idea was that with proper education and religious guidance, they might become useful Christians. In practice, it was basically a polite orphanage where everyone knew exactly whose kids they were. They learned to read, write, pray, and perform menial labor. But no matter how well they did, they weren't allowed to mingle with the respectable students. Even in redemption, segregation persisted. There's a record from 1742 of a boy named Georg, son of the town executioner, who was top of his class. When he asked to train as a clerk, the school board refused, writing, and I quote, "His hand has touched unclean things," which feels like a particularly poetic way of saying we're still jerks. With Musengao, the marriage problem. Now, let's talk about love again, because nothing reveals hypocrisy like a medieval wedding. Executioners, children weren't allowed to marry outside. They're cast without special permission. Some towns even had official marriage bans, called a Heverbote, that lasted generations. If a normal citizen fell in love with an executioner's daughter, they needed a written exemption from the city council. These letters were rare, expensive, and usually humiliating to obtain. One poor man in Augsburg spent 5 years petitioning to marry a hangman's daughter. When permission finally came, it included a condition. He had to move to another district so the neighbors wouldn't gossip. Because nothing says true love like enforced relocation. Like a royal curiosity. Adoption as public virtue. Every now and then, a noble family decided to make a show of moral superiority by rescuing one of these outcast children. It was charity with a PR department. There's a delightful record from 1690s France. A minor countess adopted a little girl whose father had been the regional executioner. The court diary notes, "Her ladyship took in the child to prove that grace conquers heredity." Very inspirational. Except the same diary adds, the child ate apart from the household staff. So yes, grace conquered heredity. As long as it stayed in the servant's wing. Still, gestures like these mattered. They cracked open the door of acceptance. Even if only an inch, some adopted children actually rose through society, becoming governesses, scribes, even minor nuns. The church, ever pragmatic, found it convenient to absorb these blemished souls, provided they took vows of silence. A tidy solution for everyone. Ite disguises and name changes. For many, the easiest path to freedom was simply disappearing. As towns grew and record-keeping lagged behind, plenty of executioners' children changed their names. They shaved a syllable here, swapped a consonant there, and poof, instant reinvention. A Schmidt became a Schmid. A Sanson might turn into Samson. New town, new trade, new story. Some even forged baptism certificates or bribed priests to accidentally misrecord their parentage. It was the medieval equivalent of editing your online bio, only riskier. One account from Switzerland tells of a young woman named Anna, daughter of a hangman, who ran away to Basel and joined a convent under the name Anna Bauer. She lived there 40 years, quietly praying, teaching, and never once mentioned her past. When she died, the abbess noted that she had been a gentle soul with secrets. Sometimes redemption doesn't need a spotlight, just peace. The strange case of the French Sansons. But not everyone wanted to disappear. Some families leaned into the role and turned it into a dynasty of their own. Enter the Sanson family, France's most famous line of executioners, spanning 6 generations. They started in the 17th century and lasted all the way to the French Revolution. By the 1700s, the Sansons were practically celebrities. They executed kings, nobles, revolutionaries, and they did it with style. Charles-Henri Sanson, the most famous of the bunch, beheaded Louis XVI himself. He was educated, cultured, even rumored to read philosophy between jobs. People feared him, but also gossiped about his charm. His children inherited the profession too. And while the rest of Europe tried to forget their hangman, France did the opposite. It gave them front row seats to history. The Sansons dined with politicians, advised surgeons on anatomy, and lived in decent Paris apartments. Their children received schooling, good clothes, and somehow friends. It's almost comical. The same society that ostracized German executioners turned the French ones into minor celebrities, because nothing says Vive la France like consistent hypocrisy. With Mosendau, when empathy outgrew the profession. But even the Sansons got tired. By the 19th century, the family name was both an honor and a curse. The last Sanson tried to become a journalist. Yes, really. And wrote about the ethics of capital punishment. He argued that executions brutalized society more than they purified it. A surprisingly modern take. From a man whose ancestors owned 3 guillotines. His essays were published anonymously, of course. Some habits of secrecy die hard. With Mosendau across the channel. England's quiet hangman. Meanwhile, in England, things were less glamorous. Hangmen there were usually hired per job, paid in beer and coin, and forgotten immediately after. But even they had children. And those children lived much the same half-life as their continental cousins, whispered about, underpaid, unemployable. A few records survive of hangmen's sons joining the Navy, because apparently, serving on a damp ship full of cannons was still a social upgrade. There's also a small note from a London parish book in 1710. Child of the executioner baptized quietly at dawn. which is such a polite way to say we didn't want anyone to see us doing this. With Musendao, the half-forgiven generations. By the late 18th century, the Enlightenment had arrived, bringing science, skepticism, and an awkward moral hangover. People started questioning hereditary stigma. Writers like Voltaire and Diderot mocked the idea that sin could travel through bloodlines. And slowly, the walls began to crack. Cities lifted bans on executioner families entering guilds. Some even allowed their children into universities, provided they studied something practical, like medicine or law enforcement, which, to be fair, made sense. No one wanted an ex-hangman's kid majoring in poetry. The reform was uneven, but it was real. By the dawn of the 19th century, children of dishonor were gradually becoming just children. With Musendao, the inheritance of silence. Even after the stigma faded on paper, the silence stayed in families. Many descendants never told their own children what their ancestors had done. It wasn't shame exactly, more like exhaustion. They'd spent centuries trying to prove themselves. Sometimes, forgetting was the final act of healing. Modern genealogists occasionally stumble upon the truth while tracing family trees. A dusty record, a strange occupation listed beside a birth. Suddenly, a great-great-grandfather turns out to have been master of justice. And the reaction is always the same. A mix of horror, curiosity, and reluctant pride. Because really, those ancestors kept society running. Just from the shadows. What happened to the children? So, what happened to the children born to executioners? They grew up. They learned to adapt. Some became healers. Some vanished into new names. A few rose high enough to change the very system that condemned them. Their story isn't one of tragedy, really. It's one of quiet endurance. Generations surviving not by defiance, but by patience. And somewhere in the background of every neat European town, there's a forgotten grave marked with a small cross, maybe a broken sword carved into it. The descendants walk past it without knowing. And honestly, maybe that's fine. Because anonymity was all those families ever wanted. With Musendao floating toward the end. So as we drift toward the close of this long, gentle dive, think of the sound of a blade being cleaned in a quiet room. Not out of violence, just habit. A parent teaching a child to care for their tools, to be precise, to take pride even in a hated craft. The world outside changes, forgets, rebuilds. But inside that small house at the edge of town, the candle burns the same way. Steady, unbothered, human. With Musendao, closing whispers. That's the secret history of the children of executioners. The generations who lived between law and mercy, exclusion and service. They remind us that even the most cursed legacies can soften with time. So if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. Imagine the echo of boots on cobblestone, fading into mist. The faint smell of herbs and steel, and the slow, endless rhythm of a world that kept turning, even for its outcasts. You're still here. That means the night has settled in properly now. Soft, weightless, a little unreal. The perfect hour to talk about things that are half remembered and half erased. Tonight, We're watching the end of the executioners, the moment when their bloodlines thinned, their houses emptied, and their names sank beneath the dust. Ito te seir the age of discomfort. By the middle of the 1800s, the world had a strange problem. Everyone believed themselves modern, enlightened, humane. Yet the old rituals of public death still existed. In France, the guillotine clattered on in bright daylight. In Britain, crowds still pressed shoulder to shoulder for a hanging. And across the German states, the hereditary masters of justice kept working in silence, performing a service nobody wanted, but everyone demanded. But things were changing. Printing presses multiplied images of death. Reporters described every detail. For the first time, people saw what their laws did, and they didn't like it. Ito te seir the Sanson Twilight, the famous Sanson family. The ones who had executed kings tried to ride the wave of change. After the revolution, they'd become part technicians, part bureaucrats. Their job wasn't a moral one anymore. It was administrative. Louis XVI was long gone, and so was the grandeur of public justice. By the 1840s, the last Sanson, Henri Clément, wanted out. He wrote essays under a false name, arguing that the death penalty should end altogether. When the papers discovered who the author was, they reacted with fascination and disgust. The hangman pleads for mercy, one headline said. It was meant as ridicule, but it sounded almost holy. Henri never got his wish. He died poor, but free of the job. His sons refused to continue the line. For the first time in 2 centuries, Paris had to hire a stranger to hold the blade. The professional era. Elsewhere, the change came quietly. Executioners stopped being families. They became state employees. No more hereditary houses on the edge of town. No more secret apprenticeships. Just a line item in a government ledger. In Prussia and Austria, the new executioners were chosen from retired soldiers. Men trained in obedience, not lineage. They were given uniforms, pensions, and silence. The old executioner families faded into the countryside, keeping their secrets. Some pretended to be farmers. Others became blacksmiths or healers. Every generation moved a little farther from the scaffold, until the memory dissolved. It's odd. The very system that shunned them for centuries finally made them unnecessary. Ito te seir the quiet aftermath. Imagine a cottage in Bavaria around 1880. The last executioner of the district is dying. His tools, the broad-bladed sword, the iron shackles, the ledger of names, are stacked neatly in a chest. No one will touch them again. Outside, his grandson is reading a newspaper about steam engines and telegraphs. The boy doesn't know the stories. He only knows that his family name feels heavy when strangers hear it. That's how history disappears. Not with rebellion, but with relief. The cities forget. By the start of the 20th century, most European cities had forgotten their executioners' quarters. The little houses once marked on maps as Henker House or Maison de Bureau were demolished or turned into bakeries. Tourists walked over the cobblestones where hangmen had stood, unaware. And that's good in a way. The erasure meant the stigma finally stopped hurting. But it also meant the stories, the strange humanity of those families slipped into archives and folklore. Folk songs that once warned children not to anger the hangman's son lost their meaning. Tavern jokes stopped making sense. Silence filled the gap where fear used to live. Ito te seir Fathimathan, new executioners, old ghosts. Still, the profession didn't vanish overnight. It just changed shape. In the 20th century, modern states kept their executioners, now masked by bureaucracy. They were called technicians, warders, officials. Paperwork replaced ceremony. No one cheered or booed anymore. But the ghosts lingered. In Germany, the last state executioner, Johann Reichardt, carried out over 3,000 deaths across 2 world wars. He came from a family of old executioners. Proof that bloodlines have a long memory. After 1945, he was tried by the Allies for war crimes, then quietly released. He spent his final years giving lectures on justice and regret. He died alone. A century earlier, his ancestors had begged for acceptance. He lived to see the world reject the entire trade. The science of forgetting. Anthropologists in the 1970s started digging into parish records, looking for traces of the old executioner families. They found scattered fragments, names scratched out, marriages annulled, children baptized under false fathers. One historian described it beautifully. History erased them with the same precision they once used to erase others. Modern descendants sometimes discover the truth by accident. A family coat of arms with a sword or a raven. A rumor of noble blood that turns out to be something else entirely. It's rarely shame that follows. More like fascination. Because these were people who lived at the edge of morality and necessity. And somehow they made that edge a home. Ito te seir Fathimathan, the final executions. Every country had its last. In France, the final use of the guillotine was in 1977. The executioner, Marcel Chevalier, said afterward, "It was just a job." He died in 2008, the last of a line that began with the Sansons. In Britain, 2 men, Albert Pierre Point and Harry Allen, were the final professional hangmen. Pierre Point retired quietly, opening a pub called Help the Poor Struggler. He refused to talk about his work, except to say, "I do not believe it prevented one single murder." In Germany, executions were abolished in the 1940s for most regions. But the shadows lasted longer. The children of the last hangman simply stopped mentioning their names. By the end of the century, the hereditary taint that had haunted Europe for 600 years was gone. But so were the people who had carried it. What do we do with their memory now? Maybe the answer is simple. We remember that justice was once a craft. Brutal, yes, but careful. And that the people who wielded it were as trapped as those they punished. They lived between sin and service, hated for keeping the peace. Their children paid for it, generation after generation, until the world finally looked away. That's the thing about moral progress. It often starts by forgetting who paid the price. Ito te seir Fathimathan, a house without a name. There's a small museum in Nuremberg today. If you walk down a side street near the old walls, you'll find a reconstructed Henker house, executioner's house. Inside, there's a narrow staircase, a wooden table, a few rusted blades behind glass. But there's no genealogy, no family portraits. The curators chose to keep it anonymous. They said they wanted the place to belong to all the forgotten families, not just one. You stand there, listening to the creak of the beams, and realize this was once a home. Children played here. Someone cooked. Someone prayed. Someone dreamed of getting away. The ghosts don't whisper about death. They whisper about belonging. The echo in modern blood. Sometimes historians run DNA studies on old bones found near Gallows Hills. They find nothing special, not the same mix as everyone else. No curse, no stain, just human.